Late on the night of June 9th, 1912, in a quiet Midwestern Iowa town named Villisca, something happened that would shatter the peace forever. 8 people, parents, children, and 2 visiting sisters, died in their beds. Their bodies lay hidden in shadows. Their killer vanished before sunrise. No motive, no witness. To this day, no one has been convicted. Why does this case continue to haunt us? Because every clue seems to draw us deeper into darkness, not out. Tonight, we begin the journey to uncover what really happened in Villisca, and to ask a question you'll carry with you. Can justice ever truly be served when the evidence is scattered, the suspects are many, and the record's fading? To understand the betrayal inside those walls, we must first understand the people. Josiah Joe B. Moore was 30-something, respected in Villisca. He ran a John Deere implement business. He had worked years for Frank F. Jones before branching out on his own. Their former friendship would later become a matter of suspicion. His wife, Sarah, née Montgomery, was a devoted mother and active in church life. Together, they had 4 children: Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. That Sunday evening, the family attended a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. Sarah had coordinated it. Accompanying them were 2 youngsters from nearby farms: Ina May Stillinger, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 11, or 12 by some records. They walked home sometime after 9:30 p.m., arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The night was ordinary, the town quiet, the family at rest. Nothing seemed out of place. But in that calm, the seeds of horror were being planted. When morning came, a neighbor named Mary Peckham grew uneasy. She noticed the Moore household was silent. No early chores, no movement. She knocked. No answer. The front door was locked. She let the chickens out, then contacted Ross Moore, Joe's brother, to come check on them. Ross arrived, unlocked the door with a duplicate key, and entered. In the guest bedroom, he found 2 lifeless girls, Ina and Lena. Rooms beyond revealed more bodies. The Moores' children, parents, each struck multiple times, their lives extinguished in their beds. The crime scene erupted into chaos. Townspeople poured in. They looked, speculated, handled evidence. Even pieces of bone were taken as morbid souvenirs. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Joe Moore, was found in the guest compartment. In the early hours, investigators estimated the killings occurred between midnight and 2 a.m., or up to 5 a.m. Some bodies showed defensive wounds, others bore scores of blows. What were investigators to make of a scene so unthinkable? A family unknown to fear, fallen without warning. In that hour, they would gather clues, some chilling, some contradictory, and begin a hunt for a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air. If you were the first investigator to walk into that house, what would strike you first? The sealed mirrors? The draped covers? The absence of footprints outside? Hold that image. We're about to look closer at every detail. It's in the fragments and the inconsistencies that this case lives. Investigators found 2 spent cigarettes in the attic, as if someone had waited, watching, perhaps listening, before descending to strike. In the upstairs rooms, gas lamp chimneys have been removed or dimmed, leaving only faint, uncertain light. A fragment of a keychain, not belonging to any member of the Moore household, was discovered. Then there's the brutal detail. Josiah Moore received more axe blows than all the others combined. His face was mutilated so deeply his eyes were destroyed. It's believed he was struck using the blade before further blows with the wooden side. The ceiling above his bed bore a gouge. The killer may have lifted the axe so high as to push into the ceiling. Yet, curiously, J.B. Moore's wallet, with cash inside, was found untouched. The motive of theft seems absent. Mirrors throughout the house were covered, clothing or fabric draped over them. Why? What does one do with mirrors in a house after extinguishing life? These clues are faint whispers. We can't yet claim they point to one person, but they draw boundaries around possibility. Someone who knew the house, someone confident in the dark, someone who wanted to exert control. Which piece of evidence moves you? the attic cigarettes, the broken lamp, the keychain fragment, or the covered mirrors? Keep your answer in mind as we press forward. Night gave way to confusion. The early investigation was hurried, underprepared, and hampered by mistakes. The coroner arrived late, failing to record detailed initial notes. The town marshal allowed score of onlookers to enter the home before securing the scene. Many walked through rooms, picked up the axe, touched the bodies. Bloodhounds were brought in, but their scent trail was lost, muddied, likely by crowds and commotion. Out in the countryside, posses scoured farmland, woodlets, barns. But nothing credible emerged. At a grand jury inquest the next day, June 11th, investigators interviewed 13 people. But no witness definitively placed anyone in or around the house between midnight and early morning. One man, a federal criminologist, suggested that insiders might have been involved, that someone from Villisca knew the family, the rhythms of the house. But townspeople, proud and defensive, quickly branded him drunk and chased him out. Already, suspicion and resentment mingled with grief. The more investigators probed, the more they stirred community nerves. If you were an investigator in 1912, with limited tools, how would you begin to narrow suspects? Would you start by asking who knew the family best, or who stood to gain something? Your logic might differ from 1912's, but that's exactly the tension we carry as we move forward. Between now and dusk, this house will become a battleground of memory and theory. Suspects will emerge, some plausible, some bizarre. A traveling preacher, a business rival, a wandering killer, a local man with a grudge. Trial will follow, confessions will be made and recanted. Witnesses will differ, motives will clash, and new theories, decades later, will seek to tie Villisca to murders across the continent. To understand who might have done this, we must look deeper, not just at the cold facts, but into human motives, fear, resentment, desperation. We'll trace each suspect's history, examine their possible connections, and see who falls under the harsh light of scrutiny. But before we go on, I want to hear from you. Based on what we've seen so far, who do you lean toward? Someone inside the town or someone passing through? Which piece of evidence feels most telling to you? Leave your theories below. We may revisit and weigh them later in the series. Stay with me. The next hour will push us closer to the center of this mystery and demand you reconsider what you assumed. At the edge of Iowa, nestled between rolling fields and a web of dusty rails, a town where everyone knew each other's names, where church bells marked the rhythm of the day, and where no one locked their doors because danger simply wasn't supposed to exist here. Sunday, June 9th, 1912. It began like any other summer Sunday in Villisca, filled with songs, recitations, and laughter from nearly every family and another. Among the attendees were two young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger. They were close friends of the Moore children, especially Catherine. When the program ended around 9:30 p.m., Sarah Moore offered to let the Stillinger girls stay the night instead of walking home in the dark. Their parents agreed. It was a small, kind gesture, but a quiet corner of East 2nd Street, a modest white frame house with a small parlor and an attic above the bedrooms. The kind of home where dinner smells lingered and laughter echoed through thin walls. That night, the family returned home just before 10 p.m. Josiah likely secured the barn and brought in the horses, while Sarah helped the children get ready for bed. Inside, all was peaceful. Upstairs, the four more children fell asleep side by side. In the guest room downstairs, Lena and Ina settled under neatly folded quilts. The lamp was turned low. The front door, as usual, left unlocked. But someone else was awake that night. Several residents reported seeing a shadowy figure near the Moore home earlier that day, a man carrying a briefcase, dressed neatly in a black coat, standing near the hardware store just after sunset. No one thought much of it then. Villisca was a town of travelers, of salesmen and preachers passing through. But one witness later claimed the man had followed the family home. Could this have been Reverend George Kelly, the eccentric traveling preacher who attended that same Children's Day service and left town by train at dawn? Or was it someone else, someone waiting patiently for the lights to go out? If you were walking home that night and saw a stranger watching a family disappear into their home, would you stop and ask who he was? Or would you keep walking? Inside the house, the night grew still. A lamp flickered faintly at the foot of the staircase. The final light in the Moore home was seen by a neighbor, Mary Peckham, sometime around 10:30 p.m. She would be the first to notice, the next morning, that something wasn't right. But for now, the world outside continued as usual. Horses shifting in their stalls, a train whistle echoing across the plains, and the slow, rhythmic hum of a town deep in slumber. Somewhere, in the dead of night, movement stirred. A lantern, its chimney removed to cast only a dim glow. Footsteps, careful, deliberate, moving from room to room. No one woke. No screams were heard. The next morning, Villisca would awaken to a silence that felt wrong. A neighbor would sense it before anyone else, noticing the stillness, the uncollected chores, and a house that remained locked tight. But that's where we'll pick up, because before anyone opened that front door, the killer had already vanished, leaving behind one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. What could drive someone to step into a home filled with innocence and erase it completely? Was it hatred, obsession, or something far colder? An act without reason at all? As the sun rose over Villisca that Monday morning, neighbors would soon discover a scene that defied every notion of safety, of community, of humanity itself. And you, watching this now, will have to ask yourself, when a killer leaves no trail, no motive, and no confession that holds, does the truth die with them? The morning of June 10th, 1912, began like any other in Villisca. The sun was up early, the air was thick with the scent of lilac and fresh hay, and across the street from the Moore home, neighbor Mary Peckham began her daily chores. She swept her porch, hung laundry, and glanced occasionally at the Moore house, a habit, really. They were good neighbors, reliable, always up with the dawn. But this morning, the house was still, too still. By 7 a.m., there was no sign of Josiah Moore in his yard. The horses hadn't been fed. No children's voices drifted through the open windows. Not even the sound of Sarah bustling about the kitchen. Mary walked closer, calling softly, "Sarah?" No answer. She tried the door. Locked. That was unusual. The Moores never locked their doors. Mary waited a moment. Then she stepped back and decided to contact Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who owned a nearby store. Within minutes, Ross arrived, neatly dressed, concerned but calm. He knocked. No answer. He called through the windows. Silence. What would you do in that moment, when the ordinary suddenly feels wrong? Would you keep knocking, or walk away and try to forget the feeling rising in your chest? Ross used his spare key to open the front door. The air inside was heavy, unmoving. Dim light seeped through the curtains. He stepped inside and called out again. Nothing. The parlor was neat, untouched. He turned toward the guest room. That's when he saw them. Two bodies beneath a blanket. Blood splattered on the wall. It was Lena and Ina Stillinger. Ross staggered back, calling for Mary to fetch the marshal. What he saw that day would haunt Villisca for generations. Because when Sheriff Hank Horton arrived minutes later, he stepped into one of the most gruesome crime scenes the Midwest had ever known. 8 people, all dead, each killed in their sleep. Josiah Moore to a theory. One paper called it Iowa's House of Death. Another claimed the killer was a mad butcher traveling by train. But police struggled. There was no motive, no footprints, no eyewitnesses, only speculation. Then something odd emerged. Just weeks earlier, in nearby towns, Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paola, Kansas, entire families had been murdered in their sleep, killed by an axe. Faces covered, lamps adjusted to dim light. Sound familiar? Could Villisca's killer have been part of a larger pattern? A traveling murderer moving by train from town to town? Would you believe in coincidence or a serial hand behind the curtain? As days turned to weeks, Villisca was no longer the same town. Doors were locked, windows nailed shut. Families kept lamps burning through the night. Men carried weapons to bed. Children whispered about ghosts. Fear had rooted itself deep in the soil of Villisca. The murder house stood quiet, the air thick with questions and an unease that would linger for generations. The investigation had begun, but answers were nowhere to be found. And as the years passed, suspects would rise and fall. Ministers, drifters, even respected townsmen. But none would bring closure. The Moore home became more than a crime scene. It became a wound, one that refused to heal. And so the question remains, was the killer a stranger passing through the night? Or was he someone the town knew? Someone they'd spoken to in church? Someone still watching from the shadows? By late summer of 1912, Villisca had changed. A once peaceful town of church picnics and open doors now lived under a shadow. Everyone had theories. Everyone had someone to blame. The murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls had become a national obsession, and the hunt for a killer turned into something darker, a hunt for someone to blame. In a town as small as Villisca, gossip spreads faster than the truth. Neighbors began looking sideways at one another, at the quiet store clerk, the traveling salesman, the stranger at the depot. Every peculiar glance, every odd word became evidence. And soon, the rumors found a target. The first major suspect was Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly, the traveling preacher from England who had attended the Children's Day program at the Moores church the night before the murders. Kelly was peculiar, small-framed, nervous, and intensely religious. He claimed to receive visions from God. But what unsettled people most wasn't his sermons. It was his behavior. He'd often send inappropriate letters to women, boasting of his special mission from the Lord. And after the Villisca murders, he showed an unusual interest in the case. He even wrote letters to investigators, describing details that had never been released to the public. How could he have known those details? Was it divine revelation or a slip of guilt? On the morning after the murders, Reverend Kelly boarded a train at 5:19 a.m., just hours after the killings. A couple on that same train later testified that Kelly told them 8 souls had been butchered in Villisca that night. The problem? The murders weren't yet public knowledge. Was this the confession of a killer who couldn't hold his secret, or the ramblings of a disturbed man who simply wanted attention? Months later, Reverend Kelly returned to Villisca uninvited. He claimed God had instructed him to revisit the scene. He wandered the streets, asking locals about the murders. He even posed as a journalist, questioning residents and police. Eventually, investigators grew suspicious. Under pressure, Kelly confessed. He described the killings in graphic detail, claiming voices from heaven had ordered him to slay the children of sin. But when questioned again, he recanted. He said the confession was forced, that the officers had intimidated him for hours. So which was it? A guilty conscience or a man broken by fear and mental illness? While the nation fixated on the preacher, some Villisca locals whispered about a different suspect, a man of influence, money, and political power. Frank F. Jones. He was a respected businessman, a state senator, and Josiah Moore's former employer. Before Josiah opened his own store, he'd worked for Jones. But their relationship soured when Josiah took a major account and several employees with him. Rumor had it, Jones swore revenge. When tragedy struck, tongues wagged. Did Senator Jones hire someone to do the unthinkable? A hitman, perhaps, someone like William Blackie Mansfield, a known drifter with a violent past. Mansfield had worked on the railroads, traveling from state to state, often near towns where eerily similar axe murders occurred. Authorities discovered that in several of those cases, entire families were killed in their sleep. The pattern was chilling. The use of an axe, curtains drawn, mirrors covered, faces hidden beneath blankets. Detective James Wilkerson, convinced Mansfield was the killer, gathered evidence linking him to the Villisca case. He even claimed Mansfield murdered his own family 2 years later in Illinois, the same way. But every time the law closed in, Mansfield had an alibi. Records showed he'd been working hundreds of miles away. Was Wilkerson chasing justice or chasing ghosts? By 1913, newspapers across the Midwest began connecting the dots. The Villisca axe murders weren't an isolated event. From Colorado to Illinois, from Kansas to Iowa, a string of nearly identical murders haunted small towns. The press coined the term the Midwest Axeman, but no one could prove the crimes were connected. Could one man truly have done it all? Or was this fear itself, spreading like a contagion through the heartland? Then came another name, Henry Lee Moore, no relation to Josiah, a railroad worker, convicted axe murderer. In 1912, just months after Villisca, Henry was arrested for killing his mother and grandmother with an axe. His motive? Inheritance. But when detectives reviewed his travel records, they realized he'd been in many of the same regions as the unsolved axe murders. Some investigators were certain he was the link, the phantom tying it all together. But evidence was thin, too thin. Was Henry Lee Moore a lone psychopath, or a convenient scapegoat for a country desperate for answers? By now, Villisca was tearing itself apart. Accusations divided neighbors, churches, and families. One side believed in Reverend Kelly's guilt. Another swore Senator Jones orchestrated everything. And still others said the real killer was long gone, a faceless shadow on the rails. In the end, it wasn't just 8 people who lost their lives that night. It was a whole town consumed by fear, paranoia, and unanswered questions. Years passed. Investigations stalled. Files grew cold. But the whispers never stopped. Every generation in Villisca would ask the same question. Who killed the Moores? Was it the preacher, driven by madness? The senator, driven by vengeance? Or a stranger, driven by something darker than either? Sometimes, the truth doesn't die with the victims. It dies with the fear of knowing it. By 1916, 4 long years after the Moore family and Stillinger girls were found butchered in their beds, Villisca was still bleeding from a wound that refused to heal. The town's spirit had been fractured by fear, divided by rumor, and scarred by the failure of justice. And then, the courts reopened the case. After years of dead ends, the authorities made their move against the man who'd haunted headlines since the very beginning, Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly. The state of Iowa charged him with the murder of one of the Stillinger girls, Lena, just 12 years old. Prosecutors believed his disturbing fascination with the case, his strange letters, and his so-called confession made him their best chance at justice. But there was a problem. Much of the evidence against Kelly was circumstantial. The defense argued that Kelly was mentally unstable, a man battling psychosis, not malice. They said his confession had been coerced during a sleepless, day-long interrogation. And perhaps most compelling, they had proof that Kelly had left town before the killings could have occurred. If you were on that jury, what would you believe? A preacher tormented by guilt? Or a paranoid, innocent man, broken by the weight of accusation? After hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Not guilty. The Reverend walked free. And once again, Villisca was left without answers. But behind closed doors, some believed the trial had never stood a chance, because powerful men didn't want it to. Detective James Wilkerson, the private investigator obsessed with the case, claimed that Iowa's political elite, including State Senator Frank F. Jones, had worked tirelessly to keep their names out of court. Wilkerson accused Jones of hiring Mansfield, the drifter, to kill Josiah Moore, motivated by jealousy, business rivalry, and humiliation. He claimed Jones's influence reached deep, from law enforcement to the press, ensuring the case stayed just far enough from the senator's doorstep. But Wilkerson had no solid proof, only suspicions, connections, and a growing list of enemies. And yet, you can't help but wonder if a man powerful enough to control the law wanted something buried. How easily could it vanish from history? As the trials dragged on, the media turned Villisca into a spectacle. Reporters flooded the tiny town. Headlines screamed phrases like "the killer preacher" and "Iowa's House of Horror." But the sensational coverage came with a price. The truth was drowned beneath entertainment. Each article offered new villains, new motives, and new conspiracy theories. Some papers even claimed the murders were part of a traveling cult. Others hinted at government cover-ups. The real story, the human tragedy, faded behind the noise. When does journalism stop informing and start exploiting? While the courts debated theories and the papers sold stories, the families of the victims were left to pick up the pieces. Josiah's brother Ross became the reluctant caretaker of the Moore home. He avoided the property, rarely speaking of it. Neighbors said he'd often sit on the porch, staring at the house in silence, as if listening for voices that never spoke again. The Stillinger family never recovered from their loss. 2 daughters, gone in one night, without reason, without justice. Lena's mother was said to have kept their room untouched for decades. How do you live in a town where the wind still carries their names? After the trials ended, the Moore home stood empty for years. People began whispering that it was haunted, that strange lights glowed in the attic, that children's laughter echoed from empty rooms. Some said they saw a shadow move across the upstairs window at dusk. Others claimed they heard an axe dragging across the floor. Skeptics dismissed it all as hysteria, but even law enforcement officers reported unexplainable occurrences inside. To this day, the Moore house stands, carefully preserved as a historical site. Yet, those who spent the night there tell eerily similar stories. Unseen footsteps, doors slamming, the faint cry of a child. Coincidence, or something that refuses to rest? By the 1920s, most of the investigators, suspects, and witnesses had passed away. The case files gathered dust. No one was ever convicted. The Villisca axe murders officially remain unsolved. But in truth, the mystery didn't end with the evidence. It became something greater, a reflection of human fear, of the unknown that hides behind every neighbor's smile. Why do we fear the dark? Because of what's inside it, or because we might never find out? Over a century later, Villisca remains frozen in time. Tourists walk the same floors where the Moores once lived. Ghost hunters record voices they swear are real, and locals still lower their voices when passing by the house after dark. But perhaps the real haunting isn't inside the house at all. It's in the collective memory of a community that never found peace. It's in the faces of those who still wonder, did the killer live among us? Do we let them walk away? And maybe that's why the story endures. Not because of the horror, but because it reminds us that evil often hides behind the ordinary. The Villisca axe murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American history. A story of faith and fear, of truth and silence. More than a century later, the case still divides investigators, historians, and believers alike. Each theory brings us closer to understanding, but none bring us peace. So, I'll ask you one final time. Who do you believe killed the Moores? Was it madness? Power? Revenge? Or something far darker? Something that still lingers on the edge of history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of keeping their story alive, part of ensuring that even in silence, the truth is never forgotten. In memory of the Moore and Stillinger families, may their story never be forgotten. Behind every unsolved mystery is a story that matters. Subscribe and help keep their stories alive.